Hello again, welcome back. Thank you for your patience. And we have the lovely Anastacia here now.
Hi,
And
everyone.
Anastacia is an educational content creator with over 600,000 subscribers on YouTube. And her work focuses on showing how research in psychology, behavioral economics, and neuroscience can be used to improve our work and personal lives. So I will leave it over to you, Anastacia. And yes, enjoy it, everybody. I'll see you in the chat.
Thank you for the introduction, Antonia. Let me just set up my slides so that we can get going. All right, I hope you can see that. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm so excited to be here. I always love sharing stuff about science, so this is like my fun moment. Good morning, everyone. Actually, good evening, Scott. Good night, good day, depending on where you are. As Antonia said in the introduction, I'm in cognitive science now, but before the first 8 years of my career, I actually spent in management consulting and fintech. So I started my transition into sciences, brain sciences, only in 2016. And at that point, I couldn't have been further away from science, which means that I had quite a journey in the past 6 years. I started off very much enamored in science. I was thinking that I was leaving this fuzzy management area and I would go into something very specific where we'll have solid, true scientific answers, black and white. But I soon discovered that every scientific answer or conclusion comes with a disclaimer this long, with all the ifs and buts in which this conclusion applies. So for a while, I was a little bit disillusioned. However, now I'm at a stage, which I'm hoping is the final stage, where I finally became appreciative of the nuance that science has, and also started to appreciate not only what science knows, but also what science doesn't know. And the reason why I'm telling you this is because I've been doing this science communication on my blog for 8 years now. And in this job, you make mistakes. You just cannot read all the research there's out there. And I definitely cannot understand everything that I read. But it's not the mistakes that I regret the most. It's the definitive tone with which I communicated some of the things that I knew, especially at the beginning of my career. So in today's 20 minutes or so, I would like to first, of course, correct any potential misconceptions that you might have on this topic of the bilingual advantage. But most importantly, I would like to give you a sense of why we actually don't have straightforward answers. Now, let me start with how it all began, which is an arbitrary point that I picked for the sake of the story. But basically, this is Ellen Bialystok. She is a Canadian psychologist. And back in 2007, she was examining the medical records of 184 patients that were diagnosed with dementia. And her team, they looked at when the first symptoms of memory loss occurred in these patients. And very soon they realized that there were two types of patients in this cohort. Half of them developed those memory loss symptoms around the age of 71. Apologies about that. And the other half, some 4 years later at the age of 75. And basically they started looking what do people in these groups have in common? What might be the reason for this difference? Is it the education? Is it their occupational level? Is it their background, like immigration background, culture? But actually what they found out is that the 71-year-old cohort was monolingual and the 75-year-old cohort was bilingual. So they came to the conclusion that in the process of using two languages, these people who were bilingual were engaging parts of their brain, were being more active with their brain. And this constant exercise, this experience, led to their brain becoming more robust, and hence the first symptoms of dementia came later. Now, I want to share with you an article from Reuters that was published same year in 2007 when that research came out. And you see it says here, bilingualism delays onset of dementia. And notice how definitive that statement also is. Yet, it's been 15 years since then, and scientists are still fiercely, I have to say, arguing whether or not that is the case. So in order to understand their arguments, let's first clarify what a bilingual is. I actually polled my audience on Instagram. I gave them 4 options. So a bilingual is someone who learned a language, 2 languages, both of them as a kid. It's someone who learned a second language later in life, but he is or she is native-like. Someone like me, option number C, someone like me who learned a language later in life, but would not pass for a native, but knows it well enough to communicate, or all of the above. So I wonder what you think. Feel free to put it in chat and I'll review it. But basically 8,000 people responded to this poll, and over half of them thought that it's option number 1. So a bilingual is someone who learned 2 languages as a kid. And I'm not surprised by this because in our culture, we, I think, often equate bilingualism with fluency, native-like fluency, and native-like accent. And those 2 things are most easiest acquired if you learn a language from an early age. So what does science say about who is a bilingual? Well, turns out there's no single definition in the literature. I'm giving you a few options here. So the Linguistic Society of America, they say that someone is bilingual when a person speaks 2 languages. At least here, that's as far as they go. The Encyclopedia of Neuroscience says that a bilingual is an individual who has a coexistence of more than 1 language system within them. Okay. Even the European Commission has something to say on that matter. They say that a bilingual is someone who engages on a regular basis with more than 1 language in their day-to-day lives. So generally, you can see that it boils down to proficiency in both languages, regularity of usage, and the age of acquisition. And these things make sense, but whenever we lack a generally accepted definition in science, like it is in this case, we actually end up with a lot of small research studies that it's very hard to analyze all of them on an aggregate basis, like on in a meta-analysis. And just in case, a meta-analysis is a type of research, a statistical analysis that combines the results of multiple scientific studies that were done on the same question. And by combining, we can make them more generalizable and we can make the results more conclusive. So it's a very important part of the research process. That's why, for instance, one of the reasons why, if you look at research on intermittent fasting, on meditation, the results are very controversial because there are just so many ways in which you can fast and in which you can meditate. So, okay, nonetheless, let's say a bilingual is someone who has these properties, but how does that still bilingualism translate into a cognitive advantage? And scientists think that this cognitive advantage mostly comes from the fact that speaking more than 1 language continuously exercises our executive functions. Now, what are executive functions? Well, of course, you guessed it, there's no definition for executive functions either. There are different modals, and there's like some components that are cited more frequently than others. So the most cited ones would be working memory. This is the memory that you are using right now to be able to remember what I said at the beginning of this presentation or what Scott talked about. But don't confuse this with long-term memory, because we know that within maybe 60 minutes, 50% of what we've been exposed to is forgotten. And within 24 hours, we forget over 70%. Then we have inhibition and self-control. So this is what you're using to suppress the urge to check your phone as you're listening to me. And mental flexibility, that's about our ability to sustain attention on something and shift attention. So theoretically, the bilingual advantage arises from the exercise of these components that happens when we use 2 languages. Why does it happen? Because whenever we speak in 1 language, all the other languages that we know, they get, and that we regularly use, they get activated. So what our executive functions do, they constantly monitor so that we can pick the right target language. and they suppress all the other activations that are happening. And mostly it happens subconsciously. It always happens, we're not aware of it. However, sometimes, and I'm sure all of you have experienced it, it becomes a very conscious effort when a word in the wrong language pops up and you just cannot force to suppress it and choose the right one in your target language. So this supposedly, this subconscious process trains leads to domain general executive functions. Domain general executive functions, all it means is that there's some sort of general skill that underlies all the different, that is required for different activities. So it is required for me to be able to speak different languages, but also supposedly it's the same skill that I would use not to open a box of cookies after I'm done with this presentation. And you see, the most important word here is, sorry, theoretically. I said that theoretically, this is how it works. Because yes, we have some ways in which we attempt to measure the executive functions, but they're more than imperfect. The transfer itself is such a controversial issue because to what extent does the skill transfer? Under which circumstances does it transfer? This all deserves its own separate presentation. There's many things we don't know. And I want to stress that I'm not in no way disparaging the science here. We definitely need to look in all the corners and make all the mistakes to come closer to the truth. But, and the science mostly, in that case, is doing what it's supposed to do. And I'm saying mostly, we'll come back to that later, why it's mostly and not entirely. But the only thing I'm cautioning against here is not doing that. I myself as a science communicator was more than guilty in my earlier years. As we read research, especially as we read it on a news portal, maybe it's disregarding all the small print and the limitations of one small study, of one theory, and starting perhaps even honestly believing and taking it for what it's not, like a proven, generally accepted truth. So anyhow, back to executive functions, you might be thinking that, okay, then does training executive functions in other ways, like playing computer games or learning to play a music instrument, does it have the same effect? Would it have the same effect on the Alzheimer's symptoms? And that is the question, because maybe yes, because it would then explain why we're seeing this, that yes, the bilingual advantage is documented across all age groups, but most consistently, it is observed in older adults who are no longer at the peak of their cognitive functioning. And we think that this might be happening because younger adults are anyhow exposed to so many other cognitively challenging activities that any bilingual effect on them may simply be not visible. One more thing that I wanted to reiterate, just because I come across a lot this misconception on the internet, is that bilingualism does not decrease the incidence of Alzheimer's. So people who are monolingual and bilingual seem to be getting it at the same rate. What it does is that by providing some maybe cognitive reserve, it allows the patient with Alzheimer to remain and not show cognitive deficit for longer than a person who does not have this cognitive reserve. So finally, I'd like to talk to you about that thing that I said that research mostly works as it should, but not entirely. What is this about? So in 2014, a research article was published, that's Psychological Science, I believe, called Cognitive Advantage in Bilingualism, an example in publication bias. So here, the researchers looked at conference abstracts on the topic of bilingualism and executive control from 1999 to 2012, so for 14 years. And conference abstracts is usually researchers go to conferences to present their findings before usually publishing their paper. So what researchers in this paper did, they classified those abstracts as abstracts which found positive correlation between bilingualism and cognitive advantage, and those that didn't find it or found a negative correlation. And then they tracked what of this research ended up being published. And that's what they saw. when the research reported positive results, its chance or incidence of being published was 68%. But if the result was negative or even non-existent or negative, then the chance of its being published was only 29%. This publication bias might be happening for different reasons. It could be the file drawer problem, so the scientists themselves might decide not to send an article for publication that has negative results, or they might go even further, clean up the data, remove the negative results, and only show those experiments that had positive results. But also the reviewers and editors might be less likely to accept papers that show a negative result because they say, oh, we don't know how to interpret it. Maybe the design of the experiment was not done correctly. But in any case, as we talked earlier about the meta-analysis, what happens here is that your meta-analysis aggregate is only as good as the data that goes into it. And we see that predominantly the data that goes into it is the data that supports the finding for cognitive advantage. So to check whether I'm having technical problems with my slides. Am I on the right slide? Yeah. Yeah, I'm sorry. So in 2018, researchers tried to estimate whether this publication bias was really affecting the result of the meta-analysis. So they took 152 studies, again, bilingualism, cognitive advantage, and they analyzed them. And they came to the conclusion that, yes, there is a small, but there is a cognitive advantage when it comes to these three executive functions: inhibitions, shifting, that's our mental flexibility, and working memory. However, then they use the statistical tool that allows you to correct for publication bias. And once they applied it, the evidence for a bilingual advantage was completely gone. Now, that does not equal that there is no cognitive advantage in bilingualism. So correction of publication bias is also not a precise science. What it simply means is that that more work needs to be done before we can make any final statements on the issue. And if this conclusion leaves you feeling mildly irritated, I completely understand. There's just something so satisfying in strong statements like, yes, learn a second language and you will age better, or eat blueberries and you will have better vision, or whatever. You know, these statements, we can share them with friends, we can tweet about them. And I mentioned at the beginning how my hope for concrete answers did not materialize as I switched to science. But nonetheless, I did get something else, something more important in this field. I noticed that the most knowledgeable people in their fields are often the people with the most measured positions. It's as if the more you know, the more humble you become, and the opposite is true as well. The less you know, the more convinced you are in your knowledge. So I had the privilege of attending Harvard for my graduate studies, and the most important lesson I learned there is summed up on this graph. And that's the true lesson that I wanted to share with you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Anastasia. Can we get some clap emojis in the chat, please? A bit of applause. Thank you very much. So thank you very much for your talk, Anastasia. I haven't seen any questions come in the Q&A tab yet, but maybe, you know, it's a lot to take in, so maybe some questions will come in a few minutes. I have a question which is more to do with the idea that this cognitive bias has been sold to us essentially through, not cognitive bias, the cognitive advantage has been sold to us through this bias in research and the publication of the research. Do you think that the way language learning is sold to us, because it's like, oh, it's good for your brain, it's good for later onset of dementia, you know, if you even learn a language for those reasons, do you think that is something that needs to change the way language learning is sold to us, or do you think it will, that this idea of cognitive advantage will actually aid people in learning a language, like drive them to do it?
You know, actually, I had to think about this question for myself, is how, because I am a popular science channel, so what am I going to post about? Nothing is really definitive. So I think these findings are still interesting. and we should be talking about them, but we should be also making sure that we mention that there are limits to how this scales and generalizes, and whether, and also leave the door open by saying that this is what we know right now, but there might be new studies in 5 years, and what I always say, I'll be here sharing them with you, but this is not the end of it. However, what I always tell my audience is that when it comes to all the things like learning, language learning, positive psychology, we're really not risking anything. It's not like we don't know the science on some side effect of drugs or something like this. So we definitely know that even if that the cognitive advantage doesn't hold to be true, you get the cultural advantage, you get the work advantage, the educational advantage. There's so many other advantages. So why not try? You know, I think the good thing, I don't know if you know about it, like in the 60s, before the 60s, there was this misconception that children who learn 2 languages from early on end up being retarded intellectually. And people truly believe that, like governments, it was in the school policies and in governments and in the news, and then people prevented children from learning a language. Now, that is a real threat, like when you have a misconception that can be very harmful. But in our case, I think it helps to correct misconceptions, but there's really no harm in it.
Yeah, I remember when I was a child, I was learning German at school and I spoke English at home. And I think my parents were very, very worried. It's like, oh, are my kids going to do okay at school because now they're learning 2 languages? Oh, they're going to be slow. And it's like, no, actually, it just takes them a little bit of time to get both levels at the same kind of level. And then it skyrockets from there.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I mean, we see that the vocabulary for bilinguals is a little bit lower, but that's because we are exposed to so many more words. And also, this usually corrects by the early age. I think it's, don't quote me on this, but I think it's 5 or 6, something like this. The reaction time is also slower, but that's normal because it takes a lot of cognitive effort to be doing that. So yeah, but are these real disadvantages? I'm not sure.
I turned out fine. Okay, a question has come in to the Q&A tab. Can we call someone bilingual if both languages are at a similar level, so like 60% the same, or maybe it's better to call someone like 1.4 lingual? So I know I'm 1.4 lingual.
Like I said, there's really no definition. So it's at this point, it's up to you how you want to call yourself. The only thing that I noticed is that when the expectation of the audience is that bilingualism means that you are native-like, and then you claim to be bilingual, people might think that you're trying to deceive them, but that's really not the case. I mean, I think the European Commission document is a pretty good resource that you can refer them to if someone tells you that you've been trying to deceive them. There is such a thing as dominant language in bilingualism, so we can, like when discussing them, we can say that my dominant language is that, and I think it's also domain specific. I would say that even though English is not nearly my native language, my dominant language in work, academia, science setting is definitely English. I wouldn't be able to convey all of that in any other languages that I have. So yeah, again, nuance.
Yeah, nuance. Another question that just came in, thank you. What is fluency? So does that mean native level as in C2, or is A2 enough to live in a country as a retired person? So like further up down the line.
That's a great question, because if we talk about fluency on these language levels, we should remember that part of it contains vocabulary, ability to understand, ability to speak, and grammar. But grammar is part of literacy, and literacy has nothing to do with language proficiency, because out of our 7 billion people, a lot of people on the planet are fluent in their native language, yet not literate at all. So it doesn't match exactly. I think fluency, again, depends on the context, but in that context, I would say as long as it meets your functional needs that you have for that language, that makes you fluent in your particular context. So I think if you're teaching linguistics, probably literacy is part of that concept. But otherwise, if you are just retired abroad and can get all the things done that you need to be doing your B1 level, then that's good enough.
Yeah, I agree. If you want to teach linguistics, maybe C2 is a good idea. But if you're just speaking to family, for example, or just shopping at the store or whatever, then A2 I think is fine. I think if it fulfills whatever you need, that's fluent. counts as fluent, I think.
Exactly.
Let's see if any other questions have come in. If not, then I think, someone asked, as an Italian, I think Spanish would be not that difficult to learn for me. Am I wrong? Do you think that's a thing? Like that if you learn two similar languages, that it's easier, or that you can?
So I can only
quicker?
speak from personal experience. I haven't read any research on that, but what happened to me is, so I come from Belarus. So until a certain age, I used to speak Belarusian, but then I learned Slovene when I moved to Slovenia 13 years ago, and that completely, it made me like, I cannot speak in Belarusian anymore, because whenever I try, I use Slovene words because of how similar they are. So for some reason, the monitoring, choosing appropriate target language and suppressing does not work for me in this case. And I wonder, like, if I would be now researching the answer to your question, what I would try to look up is if these cognitive processes are more challenging when the languages are very similar. So I don't know, like, it helps to a degree, but it can also be a hindrance.
Yeah, I can imagine if you speak two very similar languages that there's a higher chance perhaps of mixing the two up or speaking both at the same time. I do it with German and English, and they're not even that similar. So similar enough to mix. So okay, I think that's it for the questions that have come in. So thank you very much in the chat.
Thank you for having me.
And where can everyone find you, Anastacia? Do you have anywhere to share?
Well, actually, you can try going to blog.anastaciakay.com. That's something that I came up with literally yesterday. Oh, what if I start sending a newsletter in English? So it's just been made. It's not looking perfect yet, but if you
heard it here first, everybody. You heard it here first. Hot off the press. Exactly. This new blog.
So it's blog.anastaciakay.com. Yeah.
Okay, we'll put the link in the chat later.
All right.
So that you can all find it. But thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you. If you have any other questions, you can reach me on social media. I'm happy to talk more.
Absolutely. So everyone, this was a very insightful talk. Thank you so much. And let's have some more clap emojis in the chat. Thank you. And we will continue in a few minutes with the next talk. And Danielle will be introducing. So I'll say bye-bye for now. So thank you once again, Anastacia. See you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.